Good morning, and we're in the book of Job now, and I think we'll just go over to the thing, what is the book of Job? The book of Job describes the experiences of Job, a righteous man who endured immense suffering. Most of the book is written in poetic form, with a prologue and an epilogue in prose. A central theme of the book is the difficult question, why do righteous people suffer? Although the book never fully answers this question, it does clarify that trials and afflictions are not necessarily evidence that a person has sinned. The book of Job can be divided as follows. Job 1 and 2, in a prologue that begins the narrative, the Lord and Satan discuss Job's faithfulness and prosperity. When the adversary claims that Job is righteous only because he is blessed, God allows Job to be afflicted. Job perseveres and remains faithful through the loss of his personal wealth, his children, and finally his own health. These chapters are presented in Hebrew poetry, Job 3 through 37. Job laments his afflictions and wonders if it would have been better if he had never been born. Three of Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, speak with Job about his suffering. A younger man named Elihu arrives and offers his insights in the reasons of Job's suffering. These chapters are also presented in poetry from 38 to 42. The Lord appears and asks Job many questions, leading Job to consider the ultimate power and superiority of God. The Lord explains to Job that it is difficult for a mortal to see things from the Lord's perspective. Job humbly submits to the Lord and his judgments. And finally, in 42, in a brief epilogue, the Lord blesses Job for his faithfulness. He grants Job double the possessions he lost, allows him to have the same number of children as before, and restores him to his former status. Job lives a long and full life. Now, I want to put my own words in this. When I read this, I don't really want to try to answer why righteous people suffer. I don't really think that that's the question as much as how do we deal with that? What is our reaction to suffering? It's obvious that righteous people suffer, wicked people suffer. Righteous people can have very little suffering, and wicked people can have very little suffering. To me, it's not the point of it as much as how do we react to it? How do we come to God or stay with God, whether in wealth or wickedness? Either way, it does not matter. And even at the end of this book, when he's restored, I don't think that happens all the time. And so I think it's important to put it in this perspective. This is a narrative to explore these things. Whether these things happened or not, I'm not perfectly sure, but in the Doctrine and Covenants it does say, compare Joseph Smith's situation in Liberty Jail. Thou art not like as yet Job, or whatever. You're not as bad as Job was, simply because you still have friends and he didn't. Everybody turned against him, and at least you still have people around you that care. So whether he's saying Yes, I remember Job, or this story is a good illustration of somebody that it doesn't matter. But what matters is what Job does. So let's go into the story. There was a man in the land of Uz. His name was Job, and the man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil, or avoided evil. And remember, when you talk about perfect, it just means somebody that was whole, that had pretty much everything. I think this is who was what do we know about Job? Job was described as a perfect and upright man. The Hebrew word translated as perfect can also mean blameless, complete, or whole. While Job was a devout follower of God, he was not without sin. Job was likely not an Israelite. He is described as living in the land of Uz, which is sometimes associated with Edom. However, the book mentions no known historical events, which makes it difficult to discern exactly where and when Job lived. Some clues from the text suggest that Job may have lived around the same time as the patriarchs in the second millennium BC. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what's happening, and maybe some of the people who invade in this first chapter is a clue, but it doesn't really matter. This is supposed to be timeless. It's supposed to be something that we can read now and not worry about where Uz is and when Job lived. What we do know is that this story gives us something to really consider in our lives. And there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 5,000 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and a very great household. So that this man was the greatest of all men of the East. Basically, just pointing out that he's the greatest of all men. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day. So each one would invite everybody over to eat at certain times, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So 7 sons, 7 days, they'd all have a turn to eat together. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts." Thus did Job continually. Basically, he's praying for his children. He's doing all he can to bless his children, to pray for them, and that's what I'm getting from that. Though it does sound a bit negative when it says, "It may be that my sons have sinned." He's not trying to, he's just praying that they will make the right choices, I think. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves, and under sons, each time it appears, the Joseph Smith translation changes it to children of God, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And just to point out, did the Lord converse with Satan about Job? The conversations between the Lord and Satan in the book of Job likely do not describe an actual interaction between them. These conversations are best understood as a poetic way of conveying Satan's role as our adversary. The Hebrew word translated as Satan means adversary or accuser. When reading this account, it is important to remember that God has power over Satan. God only does that which is for the benefit of his children. So whether there was any conversation, doesn't matter. What it does do is give this foil, this back and forth to give the story. And remember, above all, this is a poetic story, and it's to give us the opportunity to understand why these things are happening, or what's the cause of them. So having this interaction is important to the story, and I think of it as things. I don't know if I mentioned it yesterday. Yeah, I think I did. About like Les Miserables, it's set in a certain time period in France, with certain characters, but those characters aren't real. The time period is, and where is, and the story is timeless and amazing, but you don't just discount it because it might not be real people doing real things, because the circumstances that surround them were as real as anything. And so this gives us a chance to really understand what the story is about. And Satan came also among them, and the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, from walking up and down in it. And often Satan is described as the wanderer, and I think that's where this comes from. At least that's what I understand. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil, or stays away from evil. We don't use escheweth in our language as much as we should nowadays, don't you think? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Does he just do this because he's a nice guy? I don't think so. Notice the gray in here is things that the Satan is saying why people worship. And this is really good because you can hear this sometimes in people. I've had people say, oh yeah, you're only a member of the church because you grew up with it. If, I remember as a missionary knocking on a door and they said, oh, are your parents members of a church? And I said, yeah. And they went, oh, okay, that explains it. And I'm going, no, it doesn't. I'm here on my own to teach the gospel. And this idea that we have to be brought up in it or have some worldly success is wrong. I have seen people baptized before, and it sounds like they think everything's just going to be right afterwards. That now their sins are washed away in baptism, and they're got a new life, and it's going to be perfect. And then they go back home, and they find out the dishes still haven't been done. That that they still have the difficulties that they had before. And it's false to believe that that's the case. And that, I think, is one of the things that we get from this. And Satan tries to play on that as if, the only reason why people ever follow God is because he blesses them. And hast not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance has increased the land. But put forth thy hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. So he's saying, yeah, your circumstance put you there. I don't know anybody in the church where that is true, and it's a false thing. However, I know a lot of people outside the church or less active in the church who would actually accuse people of that. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thy hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. I'm just going to flip over here. What did Job learn about the purpose of suffering? We haven't even got to his suffering yet, but we will in a couple of verses. An elder Dale G. Renlund observed that while the Book of Job acknowledges that bad things happen to good people, it never answers the why. Job learns that trusting God and not relying on his own understanding is the way to approach difficulties in life. These teachings encourage us to let God prevail, so that we remain optimistic and hopeful despite challenges. God, in his wisdom, knows that a vital part of our mortal experience is not knowing everything. There is something about trusting him that allows us to progress to become like him. So I think this is really great. We don't know everything. In fact, we know very little in comparison to God. No matter how much we learn, it's like a grain of sand on the beach. One little grain of sand on a whole beach is nothing compared to the whole beach. If the Lord knows everything, and ours is a grain of sand, no matter how much we learn, we're not going to fill up that beach. We just will not. And I think that is important to know in this situation. There came a messenger unto Job and said, The oxen were plowing, and the asses were feeding beside them. And the Sabeans fell upon them and took them away, yea, and have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Now look at how each of these are similar, each thing that happens. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, The fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he is yet speaking, there came also another and said, The Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels, and have carried them away, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And Job, now that is horrible to think all of that happened at once. And in this story, that makes sense. Bring it all together. But how does Job react? Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped. So he rent his mantle, which shows great suffering or remorse or great loss. and shaved his head and fell down on the ground and worshipped, and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. And the Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And this scripture is read sometimes at people's funerals, in some traditions. So you may have noticed that before. In this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. So even with all of that loss, he was true to God. And that is where the point is. When do we turn away from God? Can we lose everything and still be close to God? Job did. Can we?